a brief intro to David's biography. David was the executive director of the Red Lines Project. He was a columnist for CNN Opinion, a columnist for NBC Newsthink, a former correspondent for CBS News, and he is President Emeritus of the Overseas Press Club of America. And a big thank you especially to David and Vivienne for helping me put together tonight's event. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, now you know who I am. Are you hearing me? Okay, good. So 35 years ago, when I was serving as Paris correspondent for CBS News, I signed a contract for a book with Harcourt Brace to be called The Age of Divergence, How Europe and America Were Growing Apart and the Dangers for the Future. 6 months later, after I'd gathered my research and was beginning to write, Larry Tisch bought CBS, decided he did not need a Paris bureau anymore, nor for that matter bureaus in Bonn, Rome, Moscow, Hong Kong, and a host of other places I've frankly forgotten. So I was set free, set adrift, and the book, as well as my project, was history. But now, as we will explore today, not very much has changed in the last 35 years, or has it? As it happens, I've written 5 more books, and we've assembled a fabulous group of experts under the auspices of the Overseas Press Club of America to explore this very question. So let me introduce them to you, and we can plunge right in. My co-organizer to my immediate left is Vivienne Walt, a veteran correspondent for Time and Fortune based in Paris, and as it happens, just back from a swing through Saudi Arabia, and we'll get more than that in the future, in a few moments. Liz Alderman, further over to the left, not necessarily politically, is the chief European business and, and economic correspondent for the New York Times. On the far right, excuse me, Ulysse, is Ulysse Gosset is foreign affairs correspondent for France's preeminent all-news channel, BFM-TV, of which I believe he was one of the co-founders. And immediately to my right, Michaela Wiegel is a correspondent based in Paris for Germany's leading daily, Frankfurter Algemeine Zeitung, which has been all over the story of the day today, which I'm sure many of you know about and we'll explore. We had a 5th panelist, but sadly, The Economist's preeminent European correspondent, Stanley Pignal, tested positive for COVID just yesterday, probably from his son at school, incidentally. But he's gone into a 10-day quarantine, not terribly ill, thank heaven, so we'll just have to save him for our next go-around with the American Library in Paris. Now, what better way to start than yesterday? Morning in New York, coming up on an early, very frigid dusk. It was 5 degrees around that time yesterday. We were 15 below centigrade, when Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin got on a secure video call to hash out what could turn out to be the future of Ukraine and perhaps much of Europe. So my first question, with the new and I guess somewhat fragile German coalition government just ratified today by the Bundestag, does Biden really have Europe behind him in this critical moment of war and peace? And we should probably start in this case with Michaela. What do you think?
I'm delighted. Thank you so much. So I came a little bit too early because I would have loved to bring you our new foreign affairs minister with me, who is she's on her way to Paris, actually. And unfortunately, she won't meet us, but just the foreign minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, tomorrow morning. But it's very interesting to have a look at how Germany and the US are drifting apart or not. Like most Europeans, Germans rejoice at Joe Biden's victory in the November presidential election, but they do not think that he can help America make a comeback as the preeminent global leader. This is rather astonishing because Germans were always the first Europeans to rely on American leadership. But the European attitudes, I think one can say, towards the United States have undergone a massive change during the Trump era. And a majority in Germany, at least, is now thinking that it's good to have trust again in the US government, but that they cannot trust the American electorate not to vote for another Donald Trump in 4 years. This is exactly the position of our new traffic light coalition. They really hope to achieve as much as possible with the US government, but they are very scared about Biden being too not strong enough to resist new political troubles.
Or particularly Putin. Or particularly Putin.
Yeah, or particularly Putin. I wanted to come to this point after this more general exploration. Obviously, the new government has, at least on the green side of its majority, a more critical point of view to Russia and to Putin especially. The Greens criticized the gas pipeline project. They were strongly opposed to Nord Stream 2. For the chancellor, it's not so clear. He comes, as most of you know, from the SPD and was a former chairman to our chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who had very strong, still has very strong relations with Putin, and is even in the Gazprom administration. Probably there will be some waiting for the Americans on the German side, and we will know a little bit more about it tomorrow when Annalena Baerbock will hold a press conference, because she will certainly be questioned on the Ukraine-Russia policy.
And she's coming here, you said, right?
Yes, she is coming, and Olaf Scholz is coming on Friday. He will be talking to Emmanuel Macron. And yes.
It's interesting. One of Macron's aides told me about 3 months ago that he would be dealing directly with Merkel as up to the very moment when she leaves, and then immediately he would begin dealing with her successor. And that he was very flexible in that respect.
Yeah, they know each other already because he was Merkel's finance minister. So it's very funny if you look on Macron's Twitter account today. There's first a really moving little movie to say goodbye to Merkel, and then immediately comes a message to Olaf Scholz. So you really feel like, okay, no time to really be sad about leaving Merkel. We go immediately to Scholz.
I want to get on to Macron, but I have just one final point I'd like to question you about. What happens if it seems like Biden has basically held Germany out to dry on the gas issue, because he's basically told Putin, if you invade Ukraine, that we won't support the Nord Stream 2, and Putin, of course, could in turn say, well, in that case, we'll cut off all gas to Germany, and your people can freeze to death for the entire winter. So that's a very difficult position for Biden to put the new chancellor in, right? Basically, without any say by him, effectively.
Yeah, it's a very, the first surprise when Biden came to office was that he was not continuing the sanction threat on Germany. Everybody thought that the US would be very hard on Nord Stream 2, and suddenly he lifted the sanctions. And so now he's in kind of not a very strong position, and that makes it really hard for him to play on this. And I think it doesn't sound very logic to tell Putin, don't invade Ukraine, so then you can push your gas through the pipeline to the Germans. But in any case, we still can rely on the French and French nuclear power, if ever our gas pipelines get cut, which would be the worst scenario for our fresh green government party.
Right. Okay. Which brings us to Ulysse. It seems to me that Scholz is not only the only political leader in Europe in a tenuous situation, but also Francis Macron, who's embarked on a marked on a fight for his own political life and a hard-fought re-election campaign. So, Ulysse, is Biden yet again preparing to sell out his French friend? And how willing might Macron be to have an American leader of whom he's still pretty skeptical effectively speak for him, especially as Macron also prepares to take over the presidency of the European Union for 6 critical months come January 1? Does Macron worry that, in fact, yet again, the United States is going to do him dirty? No.
No. Yes.
Yes.
Bonsoir. I wish I would speak in French to express exactly what I mean, but I'm going to try in English. Okay.
Ulysse, you spent how many years in Washington as correspondent for TF1?
But for me, there are 3 questions today to ask. First one is Macron going to be the French president in 6 months or not? Who will lead France in 6 months? Is it going to be Macron again for 5 years or somebody else? And the question is not rhetorical, it's a real question considering all that you can see if you follow the French politics and if you see the latest polls. There's now a real challenge for Macron. Will he be able to overcome all the opposition he is facing now? Will there be a French president, a woman as a French president next year? It's a possibility. It's a serious possibility. That's the first question. So who will lead France in 6 months? The second question is who will lead Europe in 6 months? We know that Macron is going to be the president of Europe for 6 months. If he stays president, he's going to be the president of the European Union starting in January. And it's going to be a fascinating time because we know that he can be really the president of Europe for 3 months, but then comes the election, the presidential election, and we don't know what's going to happen next. So who will be really in charge of Europe? We have had Merkel for so many years, more than 5,000 days, and now she's gone. So who will lead Europe in these, I would say, dangerous times in Europe and in the world? Third question, is there going to be a war in Europe, in Ukraine again? Is there going to be a new confrontation, military confrontation between Russia and Ukraine? And what will Europeans do? What will Americans do? And last question, is there going to be a war between China and the United States over Taiwan? Is this, are we in, a situation where there might be a new confrontation in Asia about Taiwan? So if I ask all these questions, it's just to show that we are living uncertain time and dangerous times. And we need strong leaders to face these challenges. So the drift between America and France was serious when we discovered that Americans were supporting a new deal about submarines between Washington, London, and the Australian. It was, I mean, from the French point of view, a real betrayal, probably the worst betrayal since 1862. As you know, France-American relationship have been, we have been witnessing French-American relationship for more than 240 years, since 1778. And there has been always a cycle of conflict between Paris and Washington. It's not the first time, but this betrayal was considered as one of the most important. It was a question of confidence. And there was a lot of disillusion in Paris when it was known that the deal about the submarine was not going to be possible with Australia. So there's a lot of disillusion. At the same time, we understand, I mean, overlooking this more than two centuries, 2.5 centuries, 200 years, 2.5 centuries, that there's always conflict between America and France, but there's always a rapprochement. We have been at war, but we have been always friends again. Remember, in 1794, there was a big conflict about the relationship between America and Great Britain already. And at that time, France captured or seized 2,000 US ships. So there was almost a war at that time about the relationship with Britain. In 1862, there was also another war between France and America about Mexico. Napoleon III decided to name an emperor in Mexico who was Maximilien, and the Americans were furious. So there was at that time also a danger of war between France and the United States. In 1966, de Gaulle decided to withdraw from NATO, and there was a big tension between the two countries. In 1986, Mitterrand refused to allow US planes to fly over France as they were going to bomb Libya. Of course, Washington was not happy about that. In 2003, Jacques Chirac decided not to support the American intervention in Iraq. And I remember when I was in Washington and in New York, people pouring French wine in the street to protest against the French decision, the Freedom Times era. And we have witnessed an era of friendship and peace, I would say, since 2005 until 2021, until the Australian contract. So it will get better, but there is clearly a moment now where we see that France and Europe are not ready to be just allies and obey to the American decision on everything, and especially about China. We do not want to, France or Europe doesn't want to be seen as an automatic ally, I would say, about China. If there is a confrontation with China, France does not want to be automatically seen as, yes, sir, go, sir, about China, about Taiwan. So clearly, France and Europe would like to probably see some kind of neutrality more than to be engaged automatically on the side of the United States. That's very important. But the question is Europe and is France ready and able to stand in front of the United States? Do we have the capacity? So I would say we are witnessing probably a turning point in Europe. And if you see a lot of debate about the European defense, about the European autonomy, about the role of Europe in NATO, that's because this question is definitely the main question about the future of Europe. Is Europe able to be really independent from the United States, or are we going to be still very dependent from the United States? As you know, for example, France in Mali, in Sahel, is very dependent from the United States for the intervention we are having there. Without the United States, we would not be able to be as efficient and active in the war against terrorism in Sahel. So are we capable of being independent or not? And if we are not, then we probably will stay very good friends with the United States and stay forever what we call the oldest ally.
Well, yeah, Ulysse, you've raised the two points that we're now going to move on to. One of them being, of course, China. And Liz has told me she's been spending quite a lot of time on China relations, especially trade relations, so critical to both Europe and America. And the two seem to have had such utterly disparate views about how to deal with Xi Jinping. Biden seems to think he desperately needed Australia and Britain on board in some major fashion. How to explain that toxic submarine imbroglio that called AUKUS that Ulysse referred to with France. So how do we bridge that gap? Can Europe's view of trade with China ever be brought into harmony with Americans? Or should it, for that matter, should they be harmonious in that respect? And what happens if there is some military action in the Taiwan Straits?
Which one of those questions do you want me to take first? That's a lot. First of all, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I just want to say quickly, it's a pleasure to be here because I hadn't actually been to the American Library since before COVID. So it's wonderful to be back, and it's actually wonderful to see faces and people. So thank you all for coming.
Or half a face.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, China in general, when we, take a look at this issue of, the relationship between the United States and the European Union, and, how things are going to look going forward, China is really the elephant in the room here. Actually, there are two elephants in the room. It's China and the United States, and Europe is sort of getting squeezed in between. And China is, if you step back, kind of the kind of the context that we need to think about. For example, in the discussion that you just raised about the submarine deal, where France felt betrayed, as Ulysse correctly pointed out. But what we're basically seeing is that starting with the Trump administration, but certainly continuing with the Biden administration, that China has become the #1 priority for the United States. It's become the United States's basically sort of major foreign policy issue that everything else is revolving around. And so in the submarine deal, the betrayal sort of, happened because of the rise of China, because the United States wanted Australia, which is close to China, to have nuclear capabilities for the submarines, because China is rapidly developing its own nuclear capabilities and rapidly rising on the world stage, as it has long said that it wants to, into the position of a first world power. And the United States' position is basically, we need to combat that. As Ulysse also pointed out earlier, the United States and Europe do have a differing kind of worldview on how to deal with China. And one of the best explanations that I've heard actually came from Bruno Le Maire, the French finance minister, who I had interviewed recently with my colleague Roger Cohen, the bureau chief now at the Times. And he said when he was speaking to us that, there are clear differences between the United States and France, and the United States and Europe, especially over China. Europe basically sees China as a partner, competitor, but also as a systemic rival. But what he said was that the deal is that, the United States wants to confront China, but the European Union wants to engage China. And again, that is because the United States is the world's leading superpower, and doesn't want China to become, essentially, to displace it as the main superpower in the world. Europe's strategic priority, by contrast, is that Europe wants to have independence, which basically means that Europe wants to have the ability to build more of its own defense, make its own way on important issues like climate change, defend obviously its own economic interests. In order to avoid serious divergence going forward between the United States and Europe, Europe basically does want to be recognized as one of the 3 superpowers in the world, alongside China and the United States. But going forward, this all becomes, more complicated in the wake of the disturbance in relations between the United States and Europe. I think that France has not fully healed necessarily from the rift over the submarine snub. France still feels like something of a jilted lover. And Europe in general, as Michaela mentioned in the beginning, also feels, kind of wary about the United States, and particularly, the Biden administration. There was a hope that kind of things would change, after Trump, but clearly, Biden has sort of continued several policies that have rattled the Europeans. So.
Right. No, that's fascinating, and in fact, which segues neatly into our next segment here, because it seems to me that one of the things that Macron was doing on his recent visit to Saudi Arabia, where Vivienne spent some time with him, what was basically to break with the United States and to say, we're going to have our own policies, we're going to have our own relationship with Saudi Arabia and with the Middle East, which can't have made the Americans very happy about all of this. So Viv, the Middle East, especially the Saudis, where you've just been crossing paths with Macron, which has not gone unnoticed on the campaign trail here in France already, as you might have noticed. I was out at the Place des Expositions in on the outskirts of Paris on Sunday to watch Zemmour, and there was already talk about Macron in the Middle East there. At any rate, there have always been some very disparate views between Europeans and Biden over how we managing, though. Went racing out of Afghanistan, which was not very well received here. And there seems to have been divergence over just how to deal with the Saudis on human rights, Yemen, Iran, Iran's nuclear arsenal. Is there any way that you can see of getting back into concert again with the Europeans over the Middle East, and especially now Saudi Arabia and what you've seen there during your recent trip?
Well, how's that? Thank you, David. And yeah, thank you also for having me on this panel. I originally wasn't going to talk about the Middle East, but I just did come back from a big swing around Saudi Arabia of all parts. I was not there to cover Macron, but it just so happened that indeed I was in Jeddah when Macron flew into town with a very large contingent, so to see MBS. So let's start with the Saudis. Most certainly, there is a whole lot that cannot happen without the Saudis. An Iran deal cannot happen without the Saudis. Peace in Yemen cannot happen without the Saudis. Probably peace in Israel cannot happen without the Saudis. And at this point, it seemed to me from talking to a lot of people, some pretty high up people in Saudi Arabia, and some pretty regular folks in Saudi Arabia, that there is quite a divergence, and nothing encapsulated that quite so much as Macron arriving to see MBS last Saturday as the first Western leader of any note to sit down with MBS since Khashoggi's murder just over 3 years ago. There is, I think, it's very complicated what actually divides the US and Europe on this issue. But let's just put a couple of things in context. Saudi Arabia has by far the biggest oil reserves in the world. And as much as the world is diverging from being reliant on fossil fuels, many people, and I heard this from high up royals in Riyadh, are looking to Saudi Arabia to tap into those reserves if, what hits the fan, as it surely will at some point. The Saudis are seeing this as a choice opportunity for them to step in as being the kind of power broker in the world. So Macron was there obviously with a lot of long-term and immediate goals on his plate, signing a lot of French business. Biden, by contrast, has really kept his distance, and I'm not sure it's the smartest thing for the US either. He does not want anything to do with MBS, clearly. He has said he will only communicate with the king, MBS's father, who really is not in control at this point of anything. So I think that it's going to take quite some time to sort out how they deal with things. I think that from Macron's point of view, he was there in some capacity as Europe's, big leader at the moment with Merkel gone. He was there,
and
obviously.
In fact, taking control January 1, he's getting ready for that too, as president of the European Council.
True,
Right?
exactly. But more importantly, and we don't know how long this is going to last, of course, he's there as the last guy standing, as, the last big European standing, maybe for just another few months. And I think that for the Saudis and for people generally, if we talk about Israel, Egypt, all sorts of, important leaders around the around the Middle East, what they're looking at is a rupture that happened with Trump. Trump, as you recall, the very first foreign trip he did was not the traditional one, which would have been London. It was Riyadh. He went to see the Saudis. And that was a huge thing in the Middle East. And now Trump is gone. We have a leader who doesn't want to have that kind of relationship. And we have Macron, who is clearly saying, you know, for better or worse, this is the major regional power in the Middle East, the most populous, the richest country in that part of the world. And we have to deal with them. And we have to get the Iranian deal back on track. I think that Macron, and in some ways, Europe's vantage point is the US cannot be trusted. For one thing, we might have Trump back again in 3 years' time. And we can't rely on a kind of, you know, government and administration in Washington that's going to make decisions on foreign policy that we can go along with. Particularly in the Middle East, where many important decisions are made from Washington, but it's actually Europe that's on the front line. Specifically, if you remember, the whole nuclear deal fell apart exactly at the time that Afghanistan fell apart. So here we had a decision that was taken effectively unilaterally by the Biden administration without consulting the very countries that had fought on the battlefield and lost thousands of people on the battlefield through 20 years of war. So I think that Europe's looking at the Middle East and thinking, that's fine, Washington's going to make certain decisions. What's going to happen? We're going to have another migrant crisis in Europe. And Europe is always the one that gets the real blast, the back blast of whatever Washington has decided in terms of Israel, in terms of Syria, of course. As we remember, Macron had said, was it Macron at that point or Hollande? I'm sorry, I'm kind of, it must, yes, Hollande, that said, we're with you, you want to go into Syria, you know, you called the red line of chemical weapons. They pretty much had their fighter jets fired up on the runway.
And Obama let him out.
And Obama
hung him out to dry.
Hung them out to dry. So it's not simply Trump. It goes back a few years. And I think that we tend to forget about the Middle East and just think, oh, the US and Europe are on one side. But I think increasingly over the last 5 years, you have seen these kind of fractures, and it's going to take quite some work, I think, to get it back to where it once was.
That's very perceptive. Thank you. And you know, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'd just like to throw this out to everybody. But I wrote a column for CNN a little while ago, suggesting right after Biden came in fact, suggesting that the great fear among many French diplomats and people close to Macron as well was that, in fact, Biden might be simply they had hoped that Trump would be an interregnum before the United States returned to sanity, shall we say, but that Trump would be the interregnum and Biden would be a return to sanity. Some people felt, however, that perhaps Biden might be the interregnum and that Trump was, in fact, the insanity the United States has embraced. So how important do you think that the resolution of that issue is going forward between relations between Europe and America? And I think perhaps you two would be best dealing with that.
I would like to add a word about Saudi Arabia and Macron, because in fact, yes, the visit was very controversial. But there is one reason why Macron did go to see MBS, the heir, you say that? The prince.
Right.
Because the crown prince. The main reason why he put away the question of the killing of Khashoggi, Macron is trying his best to find a solution for Lebanon, and you know that he has been very much involved since the beginning of the crisis of Lebanon. Lebanon today is on the verge of collapse, and Macron knows that without Saudi Arabia, you cannot find a solution for Lebanon, and the crisis in Lebanon is dramatic. So if there is one hope to save, or at least to find a solution for Lebanon, it's with Saudi Arabia. The problem
And
is
the United States will not be able to help them at all.
And the problem is Saudi Arabia is absolutely furious against Lebanon because of the influence and the role of Hezbollah, pro-Iranian, in Lebanon. So behind all that, the question is what is going to happen with Iran? And all the Middle East is preoccupied about what's going to happen in Iran. Is there going to be an Israeli intervention against nuclear facilities in Iran? And the reason why the Emiratis bought 80 Rafale when Macron went to Abu Dhabi just before Riyadh, the reason why they bought it is, first, there was a negotiation for many years between the Emirati and France, but the Emirati are very worried about what's going to happen in the region, maybe with Iran. So they need more planes and more arms to defend themselves. Same question with Saudi Arabia. They need not only the support of the United States, but as we are witnessing a withdrawal of the United States, they want another option. And the other option is maybe Europe. So the main problem that everybody faces in the region is the withdrawal of the United States in the region, which leaves a real question of, a lot of uncertainty in the region.
Okay, let's Michaela have some, I think, an interesting perspective.
Yes, I just wanted to point out, I didn't want to come back to the Gulf states. Well, probably just to point out that the German position is not quite the French one. And as you might feel, Macron is talking a lot about Europe, but when it comes to foreign policy and especially to arms deals, Europe is just another word for France. So Germans were a little bit astonished that the French were so angry, and I think they talked about the how do you say that in English, the stab in the back.
That works in English.
We thought it was a little bit too much for an arms deal. But this apart, I just wanted to come back to your question on trust in Biden. And in Germany, at least, the press is reporting a lot about political problems in the US. So the thesis that Biden might just be an intermediate, and we could have, again, either Trump or somebody like Trump, is more and more winning ground. And that means that the Germans, for the first time in history probably, are thinking about getting bigger on defense spending and defense in obviously.
So they would go along basically with Macron's idea of a European defense force, which he originally raised. Is that your feeling?
Yes, I think it somehow this might be the tricky thing about it, that Macron might get what he wants, but not because he's saying it, but because the Germans changed their judgment on the US.
Right.
And just quickly to follow up on that, I mean, actually it was Merkel who said when Trump came into office during that first visit, this shows that Europe can no longer depend on the United States in the way that we used to. And we basically are going to need to start fending for ourselves. So.
Right, which of course eventually led to the European Defense Force and Macron's idea of that. I think we are coming up to the point where we need to, you people have all been very patiently sitting there, I hope attentively. I haven't seen anybody eyes closing above their masks or falling asleep. So I'm delighted by that. I think you're going to now take over, and Alice, and you have some questions from Zoom, and also in the house. If you identify yourselves, that would be interesting, because we're all community, and I'd love to know who's here to talk to us if you have questions. So there we are.
Thank you, Dave. Can we have a round of applause, please? Just quickly, everyone on Zoom, hello, and we have people from Virginia, Montpellier, San Diego, Cape Town, Paris, and Atlanta, Georgia. So it's really fantastically international audience this evening. Let's start with the in-person questions. Are there any questions? Yes. Oh, you can
Wait for the microphone, please.
And if you tell us your name and.
Okay, so my name's Sorka. I'm just gonna preface this by saying, like, I'm like pretty young and I'm not like entirely too into politics, but I'm interested in it. Okay, so how do you think that U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia involving arms deals and resource agreements will impact peace in the Middle East, especially Israel? And just how heavy of an impact will this have on EU and France relations?
That's an encyclopedia. That's an encyclopedia question.
Did you say you weren't interested in politics? We'll have to stay here till midnight, I think. I mean, I think that an awful lot has changed. One thing has changed remarkably, and that is that the US has become the biggest oil power in the world. It is now the biggest oil producer, as I learned 2 days ago when I was in the east of Saudi Arabia in the headquarters of Saudi Aramco, and they had this fantastic exhibition where you could click on any country and see, and any year and see who was the biggest oil producer. And, you know, the US just eclipsed actually Saudi Arabia at some point in the last decade. So that has changed an awful lot in the Middle East. I think that it's clear, talking to people off the record and even on the record, that the Saudis have tremendous links now with Israel. They are completely allies in the fight against Iran and
Hezbollah.
And that, you know, if it were, and so a lot of people say that once the king dies, probably there'll be proper diplomatic relations. So it's very interesting how, you know, people you think are foes are actually allies and pragmatic allies, and people you think are friends actually on totally opposite sides.
Any more questions? Yes. Thank you.
From your different perspectives, how do you see the buildup of troops with Ukraine? Is this going to happen during Christmas? When is this going to happen? And how are the different countries perceiving this?
Well, the troops are already there. I mean, they're not waiting until Christmas. So we've got at least anywhere between 70 and 90,000 and three sides of Ukraine right now, and people are saying it could build to over 100,000 very quickly. Rail lines have been totally commanded going into that region to bring in heavy artillery and armor, and so it's quite a force that's been assembled there. You know, frankly, there's parts of it I'm told, particularly if they go through Belarus, it could be in Kiev in two hours. So it's very close. But that's, you know, I think would be interested to hear from others what they feel is the likelihood of that actually happening.
The real question is, what does Putin want? And nobody knows. But what he will want, he will get probably, because America is not going to send troops to fight for Kiev, and France or Europe will not do either.
But doesn't he really want Ukraine back in
No,
Russia,
I don't
Russia?
think so. But what does he want? Does he want to seize the moment when the whole world is preoccupied with COVID, with Iran, with other questions? It's a time maybe to act for him. The question is, what does he want? And if he wants to act, he could do it very quickly, because there are more than the figure you have mentioned, that we are talking about 140,000 troops and tanks and special forces who are ready to do something. It doesn't mean he will do it, but what people think, I mean, experts that you talk to say everything is possible. It could happen. There could be a Russian intervention, not a Russian intervention in the whole Ukraine, but some kind of action, targeted action in Donbass or somewhere else.
They've already taken over Donbass effectively.
Well, yes, but there could be more.
Right.
It all depends on what does he have in mind, and he has free hands. He can act, you know, immediately, and there will be definitely some reaction from the West, more sanctions. But he knows the West, Europe, or the United States will not intervene militarily against him if he does act. So what does he have in mind? And I think even the Russian experts do not know. One thing they say is that he might seize the moment to do his last major action before leaving power. And in doing that, he would, in a way, be able to stabilize his own situation in Russia and
well, that's a very
stay in
important
history.
point. Yeah.
As
COVID is really affecting him greatly.
Yeah.
Michaela, you had some thoughts on this also, right?
Well, if I may, yes, I just wanted to add that you probably remember that President Macron was very eager to get a new partnership with Russia. He even invited Putin to Fort-Brégançon and was very angry at the Germans, especially. Merkel told him that it's not the best idea to get Putin around by nice words and good wine at the Côte d'Azur. And in fact, we now see that he's always, whenever he sees some failure or some weakness, he's always building up. And I really think, and this is probably the most worrying point. Back in 2014, he realized that François Hollande was a very weak president, and that Merkel, for obvious reasons, could not go to war anywhere. So when he decided to get back the Crimea, you say? Crimea? It was a moment where the Europeans were very weak. And now we have kind of the same situation, a new chancellor and a president who is putting his mandate on the run. And as Ulysse just said, he's not sure to be re-elected. So this would be the perfect moment if he wanted to do something.
Just very quickly, when I ask what does Putin want, one thing he wanted is to talk directly with Biden, not with Putin, not with Macron, not with Merkel, but he wanted a direct dialogue with Biden. He has it now. So what will come out? Maybe a positive exit if Biden can give something to Putin and maybe follow the discussion.
It's the carrot and the stick. We have another question.
Do we have another question? Yes. More young people who are interested in politics.
Hello, my name is Esther, and as Zolka, I am quite young and I don't know much, but I'm like interested, but not knowing much. So if Europe actually decided to build a defense, a real actual defense, what would it change like in the relationships with the US? Would it be seen as, I don't know, maybe a threat? Or would Europe be seen as more independent or something?
Well, I think what would be particularly interesting is, and maybe Liz can talk about this, is what kind of resources, financial resources would Europe have to build its own defense force without the US? Would it be capable of doing that?
We've seen during the COVID crisis, certainly, that Europe is perfectly capable of suspending all financial rules to spend as heavily as is necessary. So to the extent that, Europe has basically, acknowledged that they need to build up more of a defense, they'll do whatever it takes, I think, to make sure that gets done. And it would certainly profit some of their own European defense companies. That being said, would it be seen as a rival to the United States? I think not initially, certainly. At this point in time, the United States and Europe still remain strong allies, despite all of the problems that we've seen over the last couple of years. And furthermore, just to go back to China for a second, China could wind up being a common threat to basically both of these areas. And the United States and Europe, where they have been strengthening cooperation is in areas where they see the need to thwart rising threats from China, particularly with respect to non-traditional warfare. I'm talking about artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, areas that China has been very quickly and rapidly developing. So I don't think that there would necessarily be a threat that Europe would be seen as a threat to the United States, but it's certainly something that Europe has plenty of reasons to want to build up.
Can we go to the, can we go to the cameras?
We have a question on Zoom. This is from JP Horn, who asks Ulysse, in response to Ulysse's question about who leads Europe after the French election, what about the Macron-Draghi team? I suppose anyone can answer that. Ulysse?
Well, that's a very good question, because if Macron is not re-elected, there is one man in Europe who can become the man of Europe. It's Mario Draghi, the actual president of the Italian government. The problem is that there are talks in Rome at the moment that Draghi will step down as the prime minister and become the president of Italy, giving him less power than he is. But there is an election in a year in Roma, so he is maybe afraid he will not be able to stay prime minister. So maybe he will accept the job of being the president of Italy. But if there is an alliance between Macron and Draghi, it's maybe a good alternative, or at least a good team if there is no other possibility. But the real alliance in Europe, the one which works, the motor, on dit ça, le moteur? The motor of Europe is German-French alliance, and so Merkel is gone.
If there is a German-French alliance now, right?
No, not there is, of course, but we will see how it gets along with Olaf, Scholz, the new chancellor, and there is a possibility that it's working well. But the question might come about the program of the new coalition in Germany. They are against nuclear. They are not at all involved in foreign policy, and they don't want to fight in Sahel.
What more to the point, if the crash or Zemmour is the next president of France, how will that get along with the social democratic president, chancellor?
That's another question. I do not see Zemmour being the next French president. If he's by some point at the second run, he will be defeated, I'm sure.
By Pécresse, no doubt.
Whoever is against him, Pécresse or Macron, he will be defeated. But going back to the question and talking about the European defense, it is very difficult to imagine that there will be a real European defense, because there are some countries in Europe, like Poland, like Hungary, who do not want to abandon what we call the American umbrella over Europe. So they will not fight for European sovereignty or European defense. Only France will really fight for that. So it's more like a vision for the future, for the next century, than a reality today.
Do we have another?
Maybe a final question? Yes, here.
You talk about, you talk about Europe, but there's Europe and then there's a European Union. And those are two different kettle of fish. And how does the UK fit in your discussion? Part of Europe, it's no longer part of the EU. So which side would it be on, and how does it?
Vivienne, you've watched the European Union a fair amount, right? Your brief is not just with Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, I know.
Thank heavens, no. So actually, I was just about to say, before you asked your question, we haven't even discussed Brexit, which is an absolute rupture in Europe. For a long time, people were saying, oh, the poor Brits, they've lost out on the European Union. The European Union has lost enormously by having Britain leave in so many different ways. Is this coming through? Oh, okay. You still have 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, and France, Britain, and the United States are 3 out of those 5. And in terms of big global politics, you will always have those 3 as representing the West. So I think that, you know, in some ways, yes, they are still together. But I do think that Europe is not yet recovered from Brexit, and I think it's going to take really a long time. This is a very different Europe, a much weaker, smaller, poorer Europe without Britain.
Do we have one final question from the world?
Not current. Oh, yes. This is from Waji Lyon. How is the Biden administration handling MBS? In addition, the US passed law that prevents the sales of weapons to the kingdom of there was. Unclear what that, I'm just reading it as it came in. Of there was human rights violations.
Well, the big question is, did Macron raise the human rights issues with MBS or with, I mean, maybe. Yeah.
Right, okay, well, yeah, we'll rephrase it.
Well, as you know, there is a lot of opposition against any sale of arms to Saudi Arabia because the Saudis are using it in the war in Yemen, and it's a war that we don't know about much. I mean, we know there is a war, there are a lot of casualties, and in France,
starvation.
And in France, there are some organizations like Amnesty International who are opposing the selling of weapons to Saudi Arabia because of the Yemen war. To answer the real question, did Macron talk about human rights? Did he talk about Khashoggi during his meeting with MBS? The answer from the Elysee is no comment about Khashoggi, but he talked about individual cases of human rights problems.
And did you get a decent answer?
I don't know. I'm telling you what the Elysee said. The Elysee said, yes, the question of individual cases were talked about discreetly to try to have a solution, but not publicly. But so it's definitely not the main topic of the conversation.
Michaela, did you want to have a final word on that?
Yeah, probably because Ulysse just raised the question of the willingness of the new German government to deal with foreign policy issues. And I think that this question of embargo of arms export to Saudi Arabia is a very important one. It was already a point of dispute with the French government, and there is a UN embargo, but the French government is just saying, well, we are quite sure about that these arms we are selling to the Saudis are not used in the Yemen war, what is kind of a very weak argument because nobody knows. So I believe this might be a point of conflict with the new German government, rightly so, and it'll be probably a new kind of alliance between the Biden administration and the German government against the French position, which would be kind of not exactly the drifting apart thesis we just developed.
Anybody, final word from anybody? No. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody. Do we have time for one more question, by the way? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody. Each of you. I should let you know that we have the Overseas Press Club of America, hoping this will be just the first of a series. Viv and I will be working on more of them together, I'm sure. We have the 2 Overseas Press Club of America members here, and hoping this will be just the first of a series on some of Europe and America's leading journalists here at the American Library in Paris. So stay tuned. Possibly the next one will be following the first or the second round of the French presidential elections coming up in April next year.